Hello my beautiful friends, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Liv and today we are basically going to be talking smack about some books. Though, you guys know I typically am not a negative Nancy, although I will be very honest with my reviews on books. There are some pretty bad books that I read this year, and I think I DNF'd about 7 to 8, which we will talk about first. I feel like this all goes without saying, but for me, a writer or an author, that is their artwork, that is their life's work, and as someone who is an artist myself, I would never want to diminish the fact that they put all their blood, sweat, tears, emotions, and life into their artwork. And so I definitely don't want to diminish that fact, and I also don't want to offend anyone. So please do not take offense to any of my opinions because they are just my opinion. I know books can be very subjective depending on what people have lived through and gone through themselves, and I feel like some books are just more relatable to some people than others, and that is totally okay. These kind of videos are kind of uncomfortable for me, but also they're really fun. Like, I just love chatting about books in general, and we talk so much about positive things in the books that we loved, but sometimes you don't hear about the books that weren't so great. And for me, I love looking back at my year of reading and seeing, wow, I had all of these great books, but here were just the few that weren't so great. I don't know, I just love seeing the ratio of the good versus the bad. I have read 116 books so far this year, so to only have 7 DNFs is actually pretty good, I would say. But these are just some brief thoughts on some not so great books that I read, some disappointments especially. I just think it's so interesting how sometimes the hype can really get to you and you'd be so excited for a book and then it ends up being a huge letdown. So we're gonna chat all things negative? I don't even know what to call this video. These are my worst books that I read this year. So the very first book that I started off with January, I told myself this was going to be a 5-star read. I've never read from this author before. I was confident going into this that I was going to absolutely love it. And I quickly realized that was not the case. That is Babble by R.F. Kuang. I honestly don't think political type of fantasy is really for me. I'm more into like the fun, magical, romantic type of stories or atmospheric stories, and I could not grasp this world. I was having the hardest time. I think I made it 50 pages in, and I do have the Poppy War, so I'm not going to end my experience with her here, but I really am just so confused about why this is so popular. It definitely reads more of like a history book, which was just too much brain power for me to be able to enjoy. I know that sounds silly, but I feel like if you know me personally and you know my reading taste, this all will make sense to you. But regardless, I want to try again. I honestly really would love to try this book again at some point in time, but I just don't know when. I don't know when that time is gonna be. I don't know if I'll ever be in like an academic or dark academia or academia type of reading mood. I honestly don't know if that genre is for me, and if it took me reading this book or trying to read this book to figure that out, I call that a win. I have nothing wrong with the author. I think she's so smart and she's so incredible, and the world she was building, I could tell, was just going to be phenomenal, but unfortunately it just wasn't what I was looking for in a fantasy, so I did end up DNFing this one about 50 pages in. On a positive note though, I did also try to get into this book using the audio, and the audiobook was incredible. Honestly, one of the best audio narrators I've ever heard. So if you're struggling to get into this one like I did, definitely check out the audiobook. The next book that I am so sad about, and I have held on to it in hopes that one day I'll come back to it, but I have heard this is a very sad, depressing story, which was kind of off-putting for me. I thought it was going to be something completely different, so I did end up DNFing Tomorrow Times 3, which is kind of crazy considering the amount of people that love this book. But as you can tell, I really did try. I started tabbing things. There was nothing essentially wrong with this book. I honestly thought the writing was a little bit dry for me. This isn't necessarily a romance. It's about a friendship of two people that create video games. So we kind of walk through life with them. I think they start in college. I did love the video game aspect, but honestly there wasn't enough of that aspect to keep me interested in wanting to continue on. But I've heard this is an incredibly heartbreaking story, and I did hear some of the themes or topics in this book that could be potentially triggering, and to me it just felt too upsetting to continue on. It wasn't holding my attention. There were just huge paragraphs and pages where there was absolutely no dialogue, and I don't know, I went into this with different expectations. I would love to try something by this author again. I do have The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry. I loved the movie. Maybe me being a fantasy girl was just like, I need more fantastical elements, like maybe what if they went into the video game or something a little bit different. But I had to remind myself this is more literary, and I'm also just not a literary reader. So I think it was a me problem. I might hold on to it, or I might just unhaul it. The next book, unfortunately, I DNF'd. I think I got maybe a third or halfway through of this, but I was only listening to the audio, and I think that had something to do with it. I didn't really care for the narrator's voice. I just couldn't grasp the world or what was happening, and that is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher, which is honestly very weird to say because I love T. Kingfisher. I loved Nettle and Bone. I have loved a couple of her other books. I can't remember what books I've read, but I really am disappointed by this one. I don't know if I just wasn't in the mood for it. I love her kind of cozy fantasy, but maybe her spooky stuff just isn't for me. This is a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher, and honestly the only reason I want to come back around to this is because I watched the Netflix show and honestly I loved it, but I'm really just interested to see T. Kingfisher's take on this original kind of Poe story. So honestly I may end up coming back to this at some point, but at that point in time I wasn't in the mood for it, and maybe I'll pick it up physically again and just not do the audiobook. This next book I DNF'd also just absolutely breaks my heart. I have A Wilderness of Stars by Shay Earnshaw. I think a lot of people could agree with me that this did not feel like the same author. This read more of like a historical type of book. It wasn't her typical atmosphere. I just couldn't grasp the world. I couldn't understand really what was happening or why it was happening. I wasn't given a good enough reason to be invested, and honestly I can't remember a single thing that this story was about. I think it had to do with a girl who was going to search something that has to do with like astronomical things. Like a lot of it just honestly was not making sense. I think it was more magical realism, which sometimes I have a hard time with, but regardless I am not going to give up on Shay Earnshaw. I will continue to read and try her books. I just think that this possibly was not the one for me. Next I have All Your Perfects by Colleen Hoover. I did do a Colleen Hoover kind of taste test throwback kind of backlist series takedown video on my channel earlier this year, and while I did have two amazing books that I really loved, this one was just not it. I just will say that I don't think I'm a Colleen Hoover person unless she writes thrillers. I do like her thrillers, but the theme in this one is where our couple is struggling to have a baby, and it's not anything personally that I've been through, and so I wasn't really invested. I will say it just read a little bit raunchy, to be honest, for my taste. My predictions were correct. I don't think I will ever be a Colleen Hoover fan unless she continues to write thrillers. Just the characters and the way they treated each other, it was just full of depressing anger, and it was just really sad to read, so I decided to put it down. Next we have The Girl from Widow Hills by Megan Miranda, and this is my first ever encounter with Megan Miranda. I know she's a pretty popular thriller author, and everybody was telling me to start with this book, and yeah, that didn't go so well. I honestly can't even tell you what this book is about, other than our girl was a sleepwalker and she supposedly committed a crime, but I could think think of some other books that do this a lot better. We have Insomnia by Sarah Pinborough. There are so many other books that have to do with like sleeping and sleepwalking. I think I made it halfway and literally nothing happened. So I was very sad about it. This is another instance where I tried the author, may never come back to her again, or maybe she'll have another thriller that comes out that eventually piques my interest. But this one, unfortunately, just was not it for me. Last but not least, my biggest disappointment this year that I felt like I had to DNF because of the theme. I just knew it was going to make me uncomfortable. That is Black Sheep by Rachel Harrison. I read The Return, absolutely loved it. I read Sharp Teeth. This one came out, everybody was talking about it. I just couldn't push through. I think I read maybe 3-4 chapters, hated the main character, she hated her life. It was just really depressing to read. And once I knew what was kind of happening in this book, I couldn't do it. I don't know what else to say other than I'm very disappointed. I will be keeping an eye on her new book that comes out next year. I think it's called Thirst or something. I think it might have to do with vampires. So if she goes that route, I think I'll definitely be reading from her again. One of those cases where I feel like not every author can be completely 5 stars. That's okay. I know a lot of other people did enjoy this one, but unfortunately it just was not one that I could get on board with. Those were all of my DNF books, which was only 7. Honestly, that's not terrible for reading 116 books. Like, I will take it. I am going to be a bigger DNF queen in the new year because some of these next books I'm going to talk about I did push through, whether they were for readathons or other friends were reading them, so I was buddy reading them and I kind of felt pressured to finish them, but I honestly just wish I hadn't. And most of these are mystery thrillers, which I think is very interesting but also makes sense because mystery thrillers can be very subjective depending on how the thriller ends, depending on the theme, depending on the pace, depending on so many variants, and it honestly makes sense that a lot of these were thrillers. But anyways, we are going to start with a graphic novel that was very disappointing. I ended up giving this one 2 stars. That is Little Witches, Magic in Concord. I read this for the Little Women readathon with Rachel, Kendall, and Elizabeth, and we were all hyping this up. We were telling everyone else to read it. We knew it was going to be fantastic, and none of us ended up really liking it. But this just fell so flat. Joe and Meg were so angry. That was the biggest factor that just annoyed me to no end, is they didn't feel like they're actual characters from the book. It was just weird. It was out of character. The fantasy element they weaved into this was not exactly great. It didn't read very seamless and I just thought it was unnecessary. And the artwork also was not super great. It was dark. It's just very simple. It reads more of like a comic. This unfortunately just didn't feel like Little Women at all to me. And so for that reason, I did have to rate it a little bit lower, but I do know there are other great graphic novel recommendations of Little Women that are retellings out there. So definitely don't read this one. You can just skip this one and try to find a different one. The next book I have is The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy. I had such high hopes for this one and it ended up being 2 stars for me. It is not very memorable at all. I honestly can't even really tell you much about what it was about, but the only reason I did push through this one is because it was for my Patreon book club. I would have felt very guilty DNFing this and then not really being able to discuss it with anyone, but the main problem I had is this is just way too big. There was a lot of unnecessary language. The fantasy world was great, but the couple, no chemistry. I liked the letter writing. That was probably my favorite part about it. It kind of reminded me of Divine Rivals. We did have a very big You've Got Mail moment in a cafe, which I absolutely loved. So there was a couple redeeming qualities about this book, but overall, this just wasn't a great romance. I thought the spicy scenes were just really cringy. It was not written well, and unfortunately, yeah, this one was probably the worst book of my book club the entire year. That I feel like a lot of us didn't love it. Very disappointing. There is a second one coming out with dragons, which I may actually try. This was a big fat disappointment. The next biggest disappointment for me was Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. I love her creativity and her uniqueness in her voice, but unfortunately I think this is going to be the last book I read from her. The overall theme, which I will not get get into because it's a huge spoiler, but if you want to know, DM me on Instagram. Unfortunately, the huge reveal just was not my favorite theme, was not my cup of tea. I thought it could have been done in so many different ways. Essentially, you have this guy that's a writer, and it almost feels like a story within a story, or your story you've written has become a reality type of situation, which is a cool concept in general. But then she just went completely off the rails, and none of it ended up really making sense, which if you've read from her, a lot of her books are confusing. But I think The House on Needless Street was like the one-hit wonder for me, because this was just not it. I didn't really like the main guy either. All of these characters were just, they made me feel so uncomfortable, and I know that's the point of her writing, but for this one it just didn't work for me. So I think I will be unhauling this one as well. The next book is one that I had picked up on a whim, called Comfort Me with Apples. This book, I don't think I've ever seen one that is such a polarizing book, aside from Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough. And of course, you know, I got curious, you know that I had to be in the know, and this was just like, it was not good. And for me, being a Christian felt a little sacrilegious and just made me feel way too uncomfortable. This is supposed to be a horror story, essentially about like a gated community where there's like a husband and wife, and this wife is very concerned that her husband is killing people. She finds these different clues, but honestly, I thought the delivery of the story just was absolutely terrible. This just did not work at all. The way that the husband spoke to the wife at the end just made me sick to my stomach. I just did not, could not, don't read this book. Just please don't read this book. Yeah, it was horrific, it did the job, but the whole story and the plot was just, no. Absolutely not. I'm wiping my hands clean of that. This is what I get for just picking books up on a whim. Here's to hoping we stick more to our actual TBR plans in the new year, because this cannot happen again. This was just, no. Another short story that I picked up was In Bloom by Paul Tremblay. During the fall, there was this whole collection of creature features where they had a bunch of thriller authors basically write short stories, and they were all available as free on Audible, and Paul Tremblay's was one of them. I think there was about 5 different ones that I listened to, but this one fell absolutely flat. They're supposed to be horror stories, right? And this one is basically just about a poisonous type of virus that's in the water. I guess it's just called blooms from what I remember. First of all, it didn't really make sense. We didn't understand how we got to this point where the world was just a disaster. I don't even know how to describe this book. Like, nothing happened. We also had 2 or 3 other characters that we were following, so not only did it just not make sense, but it was confusing. There like basically was no outcome. Like, there was no hope in the end. It was just like, okay, cool, like, wasn't scary at all. This past year, I had the opportunity to be a part of 3 book clubs, one of them being the Sleep When I'm Dead book club that Jess runs, and we ended up reading the Writing Retreat, which I chose because it felt like the perfect kind of wintry thriller. And as you can probably guess, that was not the case for me, but I will say, for this being a debut, it was written very chaotically, but I can see why a lot of people do like this. For me, the bottom line was this was trying to be and do too many things. The first couple chapters, I was extremely interested. It was spooky. We're trying to find out what is bringing, or who is bringing all these girls to a writing retreat. There's a competition where all the girls have to write a story, and whoever's story is the best basically gets to be published. But a lot of stuff goes down, a lot of stuff happens. Another big reason why I didn't love this is all of our main character women were just really mean and rude. Some of them were nice to each other, but they were just nasty. They were really nasty to each other. I've heard a lot of people compare this to Bunny by Mona Awad, which I can totally see, because the second half of this just feels like a complete fever dream. You don't really know what's happening, why it's happening, how things are gonna end. I honestly just got whiplash. I can appreciate what the author was doing. It's a very unique story because she does have so many elements, but it was just trying to be and do way too much for my taste. I also read the Chateau with Savannah's book club called the Lights Out Books Out book club, and unfortunately a lot of us didn't like this one either. It sounded great because the atmosphere, I think, was in France, so it sounded very atmospheric, where all these women get together once again. They were together in college. There is a mystery surrounding this huge mansion. The lady that lived there, I believe, was related to our main character. I think maybe she was the grandmother. She ends up dying, which I believe you know from the synopsis, and you have to figure out why she died and who killed her. And this book was just overall very underwhelming. There were a lot of negative talks about the female body. There's just negative things about divorce and cheating and just so many tropes that I personally don't like. This was just more of like a chick lit mystery than anything else. It was not a thriller whatsoever. I don't think I'll be picking up anything else by this author. I can see that it would have like a very niche type of audience, maybe people that are just getting into mysteries picking this up, but as someone who's read quite a few and I know what I like in my mystery thrillers, this just didn't have any redeeming qualities for me. Last but not least, we are going out with a banger. It's one of the first books that I read this year, so at least we got that out of the way, but I also read it for Gabby from Gabby About Books book club. That is Wonderland by Jennifer Hillier. I had never read anything by this author. I just knew it was a backlist, which made me excited because I was like, if I really like this book, I just have so many other more of her newer books I can get into. And now this makes me question if I really ever want to read any more of her books. I know I wasn't the only person though, because a lot of us were talking during this discussion and I just remember almost everyone rating it like 2 stars. So I'm glad it wasn't just me, but I'm sad that we all read it and were disappointed. I know that this was the author's earlier work and she's grown so much, but the fact that this was like a spooky kind of horror amusement park just sounded like a really unique, fun idea, but the characters were awful. Don't think I would ever recommend this book. I think to this day, this probably stands as the worst book I've ever read. The plot was lacking, the romance was terrible. She was trying to include way too many things in this book, and we just strayed so far from the original spooky, like scary vibes at the park that I just didn't care. This story, I couldn't even tell you what it was about because it just was nothing groundbreaking, and the atmosphere was absolutely not there. Again, supposed to be super cool, amusement park, something spooky, and it was none of that. So a lot of us were disappointed, and I think this is probably one of the worst books I've ever read to date. Well friends, hopefully I didn't go too hard. Hopefully I didn't bash anyone's favorite books. I thought it was really funny though, now that I'm looking back, that all 3 of those book clubs were kind of a dud. It's not anyone's fault, it's not my fault, and I just think it's funny that apparently I have a pretty bad track record with being parts of book clubs, so not sure what that says about me. But thank you all so much for watching. Feel free to drop your worst book you read this year because I love hearing everyone's opinion, but also be nice in the comments. But thank you so much for supporting my channel. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully it wasn't too full of too much negativity for you, but thank you so much for watching. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in my next video.